Welcome back. We now move on to Greek thought. After having taken a glance, a look at Greek politics. And these two, politics and thought in ancient Greece, are connected to each other. The Greeks are most famous for the development of Athenian democracy, and first of all, and secondly, for their contribution to philosophy. We've seen great contributions to philosophy in other parts of the world, Confucius and Confucianism, for example, and we see it here again with the Greeks, who sort of do something different in some ways. In the place to begin, we always sort of start with the Ionian thinkers or philosophers, as they are known, around the 6th century. Ionia is a place in western Turkey. Remember on one of the maps, so we saw in the last lecture, last segment, that the Greek city-states went across a large span in the eastern Mediterranean all the way to the west coast of Turkey, and this is where Ionia is. Many, though not all, of the thinkers from this time and in this category came from Ionia. We don't need to get into sort of why that was the case. But the main and in a sense staggering contribution to thought that was made here by this early group of Greek thinkers was a new view of nature and the cosmos. The cosmos is the Greek word for universe. So these are natural philosophers, sort of the first scientific minds, at least in the Western world, and one could argue that we haven't seen anything quite like this, at least devoted this kind of attention in this way to the natural world. Rational explanations are growing over religious explanations in Greece to explain, understand the natural world. Evidence, logic, reason used more frequently, and religious explanations less frequently. That's not to say that the religious explanations went away, and there were still plenty of people, scholars and otherwise, particularly otherwise, who were still explaining things through religion and reference to gods, the Greek gods, which I haven't gone into in this class, Zeus and Apollo and others, etc. But we see something remarkable, partially because of how far ahead of its time this is. Just to put this in some perspective, the scientific revolution in Europe doesn't take place until the 17th century. And by the way, this is the 6th century BCE. That's the 17th century CE. So we're talking about a couple thousand years before the scientific revolution. This group of philosophers were already at least starting to think scientifically, starting to see the world, at least the physical world, as about evidence and logic and math and amenable to human reason. As Professor Perry, a good textbook on this subject, says, concept essential to scientific thought thus emerged in embryonic form with Greek philosophers. Natural explanations for physical occurrences, the mathematical order of nature, Pythagoras, logical proof, Parmenides, and the mechanical structure of the universe, Democritus, all thinkers who sort of went into some depth on those subjects. So this is something unique and something way ahead of its time. And it also then lays the basis for the Greek thinkers who come next, though they don't all focus as in such a concentrated way on the natural world. Greek philosophy starts to fan out into a lot of other human, social, cultural concerns as well. And along those lines, we now get to the Sophists, a controversial group of thinkers in their own time that followed the Ionians by about a century. And they were, the Sophists, teachers, kind of itinerant traveling teachers who went where the money was. And the money tended to be in Athens, for reasons that we'll get to. Give me a theme, it says here in quotation marks. This comes from a famous story about Gorgias, whether true or not, I don't know, one of the most famous of the Sophists, who was so confident in himself, in his ability to use and wield rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking, that he would apparently come into a gathering, people that were ready to listen to his lecture, students, and say, "Give me a theme," meaning just somebody pick out any subjects, and I'll start lecturing on it, and I'll lecture for whatever the allotted time is, 2 hours. So give me a theme. What did you say? Dolphins? Okay, I'll start lecturing on dolphins immediately. And apparently he could lecture, or at least he claimed that he could lecture on anything, with no notice whatsoever. So the Sophists were traveling teachers. Most of them ended up in Athens. Why? Because the main subject the Sophists taught was rhetoric, already mentioned. They taught a bit of everything, but the central subject they taught was rhetoric, how to manipulate language, particularly the spoken word, to persuade other people. And that, of course, that skill, those skills were at a premium in Athens because it was a democracy. So there wasn't another place in the Greek world where being able to wield rhetoric effectively was so in demand. So it was primarily the young males, up-and-coming males of Athens, whose parents wanted them to be taught by Sophists. So, but these guys weren't as interested in the physical world, science, the physical sciences we call them today, as they were in the human and social world. They did teach science as well, but their main contributions came in trying to understand the social world, the social sciences, we could say. This isn't the social sciences, of course, yet, but that's kind of the realm of thought that this is leaning towards. So political, ethical, cultural concerns was mainly their field of expertise. Anthony Gottlieb, who writes a great book on the history of philosophy, says, talking about the Sophists, ambassador, tutor, public relations consultant, lecturer, stage entertainer, speechwriter, philosopher, after-dinner speaker, psychotherapist. The so-called Sophists of Athens were in some cases all of these things. So they did a bit of everything and taught, again, on a wide variety of subjects. But I already told you why rhetoric can be seen as their primary subject. They also became quite controversial as well. Why? Because they taught their students to think about all sides of an issue, or both sides of an issue. In fact, one of their teaching techniques was to have students, like the same student, argue both sides of an issue. So they teach them to be able to put their own views and passions about, the rightness of this side of an issue aside and argue the other side as well. And I think it's actually even now a very useful teaching tool and technique, which I've embraced myself on occasion. So it sharpens, and it was meant to sharpen students' rhetorical, argumentative, critical thinking skills to be able to argue from all sides of something. And from that, you can see how valuable this group would be. Because politicians need to be able to do this. Lawyers, right, that stands out as well. A lawyer needs to be able to argue whatever side his client needs him to argue. As unsavory as that seems to us, it's necessary for a just legal system. So that the Sophists were in great demand. But it also shows at the same time why they were so controversial. And in time, they became so controversial that they were, in a sense, run out of Athens, or at least became overall persona non grata, because it seemed to some Greeks, most likely the less educated masses, not as much the wealthy, powerful, and educated, but maybe that some of them as well, because they seemed to be, by teaching you to sort of argue things from many different sides and perspectives, they seem to be saying that there aren't any universal truths. So that if the question being argued was, is Athens democracy the best form of government, one side would say yes it is, and the other, right, the opposite argument says no it's not. Even if it was just a rhetorical tool, you could argue, as some did, wait a minute, they're calling us, they're encouraging people to question things that we think of as sacred or as objectively true. They're in a sense relativists, saying that you can argue all sides of anything. That's not necessarily what they meant, though in some cases that might have been true as well. But either way, whether they meant it as just a teaching technique or they were questioning the idea of absolute, objective truth, either way, it caused a lot of suspicion to sort of be cast upon them. This was also true in Athenians thinking about their gods, because the same kind of questions with the same kind of technique led the Sophists to ask questions about the gods as well. So even as a teaching tool, that made some people quite uncomfortable in Athens. And among those that it made uncomfortable was this guy, Socrates. Socrates, in many ways, had characteristics in his thinking of the Sophists. He was certainly influenced by them, but he definitely was troubled and big time about the Sophist tendency to at least appear to be arguing that there aren't absolute truths. Socrates didn't believe that, and some of his career and work can be seen as an attempt to refute the Sophists. It's said by one gifted, well-known scholar that Socrates discovered ignorance, which I like, has a ring to it because it sounds silly, but what does this mean? In what way could it be said that Socrates discovered ignorance? This comes from Plato. Most of what we know about Socrates comes from his star pupil and student, Plato. Socrates shows up as a character, a figure in many of Plato's famous dialogues. So most of what we know about Socrates comes from his student Plato, which does mean we have to take what we know about Socrates with a grain of salt, since we don't have many other sources on Socrates. It's mostly Plato. But in one of the dialogues, it tells the story, or Socrates as the character tells the story about the oracle at Delphi claiming, and Socrates heard, I guess through word of mouth, that Socrates himself was the wisest person in Athens. And Socrates claimed that he was puzzled by this. Why would the oracle at Delphi say, I was the wisest person in Athens? So he did kind of a thought experiment, or a series of interviews, and went around and talked to different people from different walks of life in Athens, politicians and people in different professions, and concluded that, you know what, the oracle was right. I am the wisest person in Athens, which at first sounds like a very arrogant, cocky statement, but when you hear what comes next, you realize it's not. He said that the reason that I'm the wisest person in Athens is because I'm the only one who knows that I know nothing, that I know absolutely nothing. So what that means is, and here's where we get back to the discovery of ignorance, is that he's saying, I have the advantage, and I seem to be the only person that I've run into that doesn't think he's a know-it-all. I realize that there's so much to know, and that life and the world is so complicated that we're all ignorant. That we all don't know what we're talking about. But everybody that I come across is a know-it-all. Even a person that's not a politician talks and talks and talks like they know what, like they're an expert on politics. So everybody thinks they know everything, and nobody but me appears to realize that we know nothing. And Socrates, as a genius, as he most certainly was, knew that he knew more than nothing. He was exaggerating. But the idea is humility, that it's important when thinking about the world and engaging in philosophic thought and dialogue, that one retain humility about the limits of human reason and the individual and in general. So the life and work of Socrates, a philosophical career, really based primarily on ethics. Sometimes he's thought of as a moralist. So ethics is only one branch of philosophy, and he certainly delved into other branches as well, although it wasn't divided into branches in those days. But primarily, he's sort of searching for what we could call the good life, or the good with a capital G. Right? What makes life worth living? What establishes human flourishing? A phrase used by Aristotle, who has a connection to Socrates. As Professor Burston says, Socrates himself repeatedly denied the role of teacher. And like the Sophists, he was a teacher, but denied it. And he never bores us with wagging the didactic finger. But he did boast the idea of midwife. So that's a fancy way to say that Socrates claimed he wasn't really teaching, he was getting students to learn themselves, which is partially true. He doesn't lecture and tell you what to think. He was famous for using questions, the dialectic, to ask students questions, to force them to, or get them to rethink their conclusions, what they thought they already knew, and ask them such pointed questions that it forced them to go back to the beginning and try to understand why they thought that way, and if, when all was said and done, when they really thought things through more carefully, whether they still believed what they had, sort of come into this believing. So he claimed to be doing nothing more than stimulating thought by asking questions, which is probably a part true. Norman Cantor, I've quoted many times from his book Antiquity, talked about a vast crowd of young, rich men gathered around Socrates, a hippie stonecutter who expounded on philosophy in the Athenian agora, which is the marketplace, perhaps to avoid going home to his shrewish wife, which I guess this is a somewhat dated book, about 15 years old. That might be a sexist quote today. Cantor just passed away a few years ago. Socrates would yell out to a passerby, "What is justice?" or some such leading question, getting a soft answer like giving every man his due. Socrates would then use dialectic or logic to probe deeper. So he'd ask these questions, philosophical in nature. What is justice? And somebody would give some lame answer, and then he would sort of engage the person in conversation, dialogue, and questioning. But he believed that to understand, to live a full life, you had to think. You had to engage in thoughtfulness. And to do that, you had to really start by trying to think about yourself. Understand yourself first as a human being. Understand not just your own psychology, but then use your own life and thinking about yourself through introspection to understand possibly how others think, and then expand outward from there to how I deal as a person with others, family, friends, the community. And so you kind of move outward from first examining your own thoughts and your own life, your own feelings, etc. He said the unexamined life is not worth living, or something in that regard. It's quoted different ways at different times. So that's what he meant, is we have to examine ourselves philosophically in order to move out from there to understand. But this wasn't just for idle curiosity and fun, though he certainly believed, as these thinkers tended to do, that philosophy, knowledge, understanding for its own sake was worthwhile, because the Greek philosophers, all of the big three here and others, believed that you couldn't live a fully enriched life without engaging in a life of the mind, in philosophical experiences. That deep, serious thinking was important to any fulfilling life. So Socrates, it was a huge influence then on the course of Western philosophy centuries afterwards. And certainly, and more specifically, an influence on his great student Plato. Plato, again, his dialogues producing most of what we know about Socrates. Socrates didn't write anything down, or at least nothing survives, and we haven't heard anyone say they wrote anything down, so he probably didn't. Plato did. And Plato is one of the greats, of course, in world philosophy. One 20th century philosopher saying that all philosopher after Plato was merely a footnote, which was an intentionally exaggerated compliment indeed, but nonetheless, the thinker in question meant it in the sense that Plato tended to sort of get into sort of all aspects of life. But like his great teacher and mentor Socrates, he also was after using human thought and thinking seriously and deeply, being very thoughtful in your approach to the world as a key to living a fulfilled life. Norman Cantor says Plato had one big idea from which everything else derived. He fundamentally defined reality as that which is permanent and unchanging. So, in a sense, this can be seen as a continuation, and maybe taking it further, of Socrates' own uneasiness with the what appeared to anyway be the relativism of the Sophists. Plato is trying to, in his philosophy, and I'm sure he thought he did, lay down permanent and unchanging things. So finding certain things in the world and the universe, in human life, that are objectively true. That they're a foundation for knowledge, because there are at least some things that don't shift and move and change. They stay the same. So there's a certain permanence in here. Gottlieb, quoted already, says in the middle of his masterpiece, The Republic, one of his many dialogues, Plato tries to define philosophy by elaborating on the etymological meaning of philosophia, which is love of wisdom. Philosophy itself means love of wisdom. This alone is too vague, so his first suggested improvement is to say that a philosopher is one who loves all wisdom and not just some of it. He must be one who feels no distaste in sampling every study, who attacks his task of learning gladly and cannot get enough of it. Yet this is still not precise enough. Genuine philosophers are interested not just in true or beautiful things, but in truth and beauty themselves. Capital T, capital B. To explain this idea, Plato invokes his theory of forms, which takes us to the heart of Platonism. And it sure does. This is really kind of the one big idea that Cantor spoke of in the above left quote. It boils down to his theory of forms. So we have to try to grapple with this. What did he mean? Well, Plato believed that all concepts, all things that we can form an idea about, exist sort of on their own, sort of outside of our own heads. They're already there. And in the real world, right, the way those forms manifest themselves, or the way that they're at least that there's an attempt by the world or by humanity to adhere to the forms, is always imperfect. But they exist in pure perfect form in the realm of thought. Again, not just inside one person's head, but out sort of there in the ether, which again seems, typical of a philosopher to be sort of vague and unclear and hard to comprehend the hell he's talking about. But right, we have plenty of things today that people believe in that are kind of this ilk. Just the concept, for instance, of God. Okay, we believe in God, most of us, but where is God? Right, well, out there somewhere. What is God? Well, so this is no more ethereal than belief in God or any other kind of spiritual notion that's hard to sort of pin down in terms of having a physical life, a space that they take up geographically, etc. So he believed that all ideas have a perfect form to them, which means it's objective in that sense. So there is, and he didn't just mean ideas about things, though he meant that too. So I'm sitting at my desk right now, and my desk is nice, but it's imperfect. It's old and it's got some dents and some chips in it here and there. But what Plato would say is that the idea of table, the idea we have of it in our heads, that comes again from out there in the ether, somewhere out there, that is sort of there all the time, before we're born, after we die, that the idea of table is perfect, and we can understand that. We can sort of take the perfect idea and put it in our heads, but it's much harder to take it from there and to put it into the real human world, which gets more messy, and keep it pure. He believed that it was philosophers, gifted individuals, at least intellectually gifted individuals like himself, who were most likely to be able to understand the forms, meaning the perfect versions of this or that idea. So the perfect table he can at least contemplate in a way that maybe someone else cannot. Maybe some of his philosophical colleagues could as well. But it wasn't just, again, ideas and words that we have for physical objects. It was particularly true, or particularly important to his philosophy, to focus on those forms that come from more intangible ideas. So not a desk which has a physical reality to it, but concepts like wisdom and justice and love and truth, all with capital letters. Truth with a capital T. So what is truth? Well, what Plato is saying is it's not so much open to argument. It's not relative. It is at least out there, where the forms are. There is a notion of truth, and the trick is to be smart enough, thoughtful enough, philosophical enough, contemplative enough to think hard, long and hard about okay, what must the form for justice or truth, capital J, capital T, look like? So this is the theory of forms. That there's an idea for everything that's perfect that exists in the world. Human beings tend to use them imperfectly, but to understand them and maybe to improve our understanding of them, and thereby at least potentially improve the world. We'd have to sort of do better at trying to understand the actual form of truth, with capital T, just to pick one. In the bottom left, you see one of many pictures, is a rather simple one, of Plato's famous allegory of the cave. In one of his dialogues, one of the most famous stories that he tells, he uses this as an analogy, a very famous one. So it's hard to see from the picture, partly because I made it small, but there are some people in the kind of left part of the picture with their backs up against a stone wall, and they're faced towards, they're kind of, I think, tied down or unable to move from there, and all they can see is the wall in front of them of this cave. They're underground in a cave with a fire that's lighting it up, and they see objects on the wall. There's a horse there, a bird, a pot, whatever, the vase, and they spend their whole lives there. So Plato uses this as an analogy. So what if you have these people there, and if they don't ever get up from that spot, they don't know what's behind them. They don't know, right, that what they see on the wall are just shadows, and we can even see the objects behind them that are causing the shadows in between the fire and the cave wall. But if they can't ever get up to look around, they don't know that's real. They don't even know it's there. They don't know it exists. What they know that exists is what they see on the wall. So they're getting a limited, a picture of reality, and one might even say that it's distorted. It's not even realistic at all. And that if they were to be able to move away from the wall, get up, go on the other side of the wall, see the fire, see the objects, and even get up and go to the entrance and get out of the cave, out into the fresh air outside, it would blow their minds if they'd been there their entire lives and thought the whole reality was that wall with the shadows on it that they wouldn't even know were shadows before. So how is Plato using this to help us to understand the forms? Well, what's being done here is that and this is somewhat, the analogy isn't perfect because it moves in sort of the other direction than I think we'd expect in the modern world, because what he's actually saying is that the more real of the two worlds here is the more ideal one. The